Hi, Sandra here again talking about Numenera. So a quick disclaimer before I start. As with most of my videos, I mostly recommend you listen to them. There's not going to be that much going on screen, and until I improve at editing and manage to put up relevant pictures along with talking points, there won't be much going on. Also, I've heard your criticisms about webcams and microphones, and I do plan to improve. As of now, I'm just working on my diction, and I hope the process isn't too painful. So, to get right to the point, I have found what I think is a great source if you're planning on running a Numenera game, or indeed if you're just interested in sci-fi, horror, or unconventional storytelling in general. This is something that's been covered before, but by other YouTubers and people who collect curios on the internet. But I figure I'd talk about it because I think it has particular relevance to Numenera. It's called the Interface series. It was originally posted as a series of disjointed, unrelated posts on Reddit, which I get is not the usual starting place for a great work of literature. But I gotta say, even in the middle of an English lit college degree, I consider the Interface series literature. Despite my snobby standards, I absolutely think this series of Reddit posts qualifies as literature. So, with that in mind, I'd like to talk about how it's relevant to Numenera. Essentially, it has the same exact vibe of weird that I think one should aim for when making a Numenera game or world. It contrasts the very mundane and normal with the deeply weird and unsettling, and has a heavy throughout implication that everything that's happening is not quite magic, is closer to being due to some underlying natural law that simply does not give a shit about humans. I think that's one of the stronger points of Lovecraft's work. If you strip away all the nasty xenophobia and racism, what you have at the core of it is a fear of science, not because knowledge itself is scary, but because humans have an inherently small place in an uncaring physical universe that kind of just doesn't give a shit about us. That's what's really scary. It's what's scary in the interface too. So what's it about? It's told as this sort of mixed reality, alternate history sort of deal, a little bit like House of Leaves, if you've read that, where during the Cold War, the US and the USSR had a bit of an arms race to create these very strange things called flesh interfaces. They did it using LSD, kind of like the real CIA experiments to create psychics using psychotropic drugs. But in this case, it actually worked. And in this case, these flesh interfaces have the strange ability to dissect things, or I believe there's a specific term within the canon. But what it does is it cuts things off, but it clearly leaves what is cut off attached. Like, people don't bleed out when their arms come cut off. In fact, they can still feel it, and it hurts a lot. Horrifying, for one. And for another, it kind of leads into this sort of destruction of individuality as more and more people get involved in this expanding area of abnormal space. It's heavily implied later on that it's sort of a fourth dimensional thing, like someone reaching out of the page of a book, which I think is, first off, a great basis for magic, and something that has kind of been hinted at in the Numenera game. I think playing off of some kind of flesh interface device could make for a great Numenera session. So again, I highly recommend reading the Interface series for yourself. And if that sounds weird or disturbing enough to pique your interest, I recommend you go check it out before I spoil any more. Alright. I'm not going to go too much further because, again, in response to criticism, I'm trying to keep these videos brief. But one other quick thing I'd like to mention about the Interface series and its relevance to Numenera is how it handles a lot of its elements of science fiction and its horror elements. It has this way of referring to things that sort of makes a lot of the absolutely supernatural, surreal things that happen within the canon seem absolutely normal to the people within the canon. This is a tough trick to pull off in terms of writing or even describing a world in an RPG. And I think the key to it is to not really change your language from the way you would refer to something mundane. A good reference point here is David Foster Wallace's essay on what constitutes something as Lynchian, because it's very much the same vibe. The idea is that you don't change your syntax or manner of speaking or whatever when talking about flesh interfaces as opposed to talking about brands of peanut butter. The trick there is, I think, to keep the same exact tone and attitude as talking about the most mundane everyday things while talking about the most supernatural, surreal things. It kind of has this effect of lowering your audience's defenses and letting these absurd concepts sort of get past their barrier of disbelief. It also helps in that when these very strange things are connected to very mundane things, it sort of strangifies them. And I know I talked about this a little bit in a previous video, but I think the key there is the contrast between the mundane and the supernatural, or the mundane and the very gruesome. And the idea that they are not, in fact, separate things, but one and the same, sort of yin and yang mixed together. For example, one, and this is a little disturbing, fair warning. Given that a lot of people die in car crashes, car radios are on often, your death might have a soundtrack. You could very easily end up bleeding out while listening to Don't Stop Believing. Now, relating that sort of thing in a story has an immediate, hard emotional impact because you listen to Don't Stop Believing every day, or at least I do. And the idea that that might be crossed with something as gruesome as death really slips past the emotional defenses and trope awareness that lets us sort of filter out and become numb to otherwise very emotionally impactful things. So, bring all of this back around to Numenera. I think that you can learn a lot from the Interface series in terms of how to integrate the very weird into the very mundane. The very warped virtual reality culture that's introduced later in the Interface series is also a good reference point for the alienness of a far future human society, where reality itself is seriously in question when you can plug your nervous system into a equally real reality to meat space or the actual world. If you're looking for something to draw on for the weirdness of the past or for the civilizations your players are crawling through in Numenera, I suggest you look at the Interface series. But be warned, it's not for the faint of heart. A lot of its horror is really deeply cutting, and some of what it has to say about alcoholism and addiction can hit a little bit too close to home, especially if you have family members who have struggled. But again, despite all that, I think it's portrayed in such a beautiful, poetic way that it's worth its own merit as literature. And, more than that, I think it has a lot to say to aspiring young writers or even dungeon masters. All right, that's it. Have a good day, guys.